to the station, and these are actually very rare, these yellow Shinkansens. It's quite a privilege to see them.
That is really nice. It's so smooth.
You forgot to do something. Hazelnut crumbs.
I have 6 to 10 shots underneath me right now.
Inspiring travel. Watch now on the BBC and iPlayer.
Hello, I'm Christian Fraser. This is The Context on BBC News. As we gear up for a second Trump presidency, what will it mean for the war in Ukraine? Our correspondent has visited the soldiers on the front line. One of the president-elect's other fixations at the moment is expanding the borders of the United States to include Greenland, the Panama Canal, maybe even Canada becoming the 51st state.
Panama Canal is a disgrace, what took place at the Panama Canal. Jimmy Carter gave it to them for $1, and they were supposed to treat us well. I thought it was a terrible thing to do. If those hostages aren't back, I don't want to hurt your negotiation. If they're not back by the time I get into office, all hell will break out in the Middle East. Well, we need Greenland for national security purposes. I've been told that for a long time.
Are you also considering military force to annex and acquire Canada?
No, economic force. Because Canada and the United States, that would really be something. But why are we supporting a country, $200 billion plus a year? Our military is at their disposal. All of these other things, they should be a state. That's why I told Trudeau, I hope to have 6 months.
First 3 to 6
No, I hope long before 6 months. Look, Russia's losing a lot of young people, and so is Ukraine.
All of which has foreign leaders weighing that familiar question, just how seriously should they take him? His advisers say these new ambitions are part of a broader strategy to counter the rise of Russia and China in the West, perhaps more specifically in the Arctic. Our next guest has just characterised all this in the seeds of a new Trump doctrine. The renowned geostrategist Thomas Barnett has just written a very American-centric piece for Politico titled "The Real Logic Behind Trump's Global Ambitions." Welcome to the programme.
Thanks for having me on.
I read this on the plane coming over. For a Brit, it was quite sober reading, I have to say. But you make a very good point that this doesn't really exist in a void. Donald Trump is reacting, I think, to a sense of fear within his own ranks, which tells us that we probably should take it more seriously.
Right. I mean, think about modern globalization. The history of it since the end of the Second World War has been mostly an East-West integration process. That is pretty much done. And now we're starting to see a desire arise among the major powers, the superpowers, to decouple, de-risk those relationships a bit. At the same time, you've got these structural changes that are really driving a future of north-south integration. You've got climate change devastating the lower latitudes, going to drive people towards the north. We're seeing that with species all over the planet. You've got the demographic disparities, birth dearth, population collapse in the north. You still have fertile, very young population in the south. And then there's the economic prize of this whole thing. You know, the future of globalization, middle-class consumption is going to be overwhelmingly concentrated in the global south. So when you look at those 3 big structural changes, this is going to be a north-south world. And that's going to be in America over time. I'm talking the next several decades, going to be much more hemispherically focused. And I think we're getting a glimpse of that future in the rather bombastic delivery by Trump.
Yeah, so you argue it's not one thing, it's all things all at once, and it's coming at us very quickly. So why is he the president to grasp the nettle when other presidents have swerved it?
Well, think about it. He's the great climate change denier, and he's the great isolationist. So he's sort of like the Nixon who could go to Greenland in this instance. If he's willing to entertain these concepts, that goes a long way with the American public, just like when Nixon went to China in 1972, and everybody said, hey, we could trust this guy because he's the world's biggest anti-communist. So there's that sort of opposites attract, but then there's also just that ability he has, rather uncanny, to sense fear within the ranks and weaponize it for political mobilization. And he knows this is a winning kind of argument with a lot of people. It sounds better than us retreating from the world. It sounds better than us, fighting with the Chinese and the Russians in a renewed Cold War that nobody wants. It kind of speaks to that frontier mentality of the United States. And frankly, the EU is growing. So if the EU can grow and the economists can say, hey, Canada, think about joining the EU. They did that last week. It's not crazy or weird to think about Canada turning towards the United States or Greenland turning towards the United States over the long haul.
Just on this Europe issue, you say in your article that we're done building a world order, which we've overseen from 1954 to 2008. Does that, in your view, mean that eventually Americans will just want to decouple from Europe? No. I think there's three main manufacturing demand hubs in the global economy: North America, Europe, which is the biggest in many ways in terms of demand, and then a China-led East Asia. Those three are going to get along with each other, but they're also going to compete. And they're going to compete in sort of a superpower brand war to see who can kind of network and capture and win over the brand loyalty of this emergent global middle class, majority middle class, centered increasingly in the global south. China is aggressively pursuing that with its Belt and Road Initiative. Russia has its meddling across the ways. Europe, to the extent it's going to be involved in stuff like that, it's going to be focused more on the Middle East and Africa. America, not surprisingly, going to be focused on Latin America, because when that pain hits and agriculture is devastated and people are put on the move dramatically in larger numbers than they are today, heading towards the poles, like all species on the planet, China's not going to care about our problems in Latin America. America's not going to care about Europe's problems in the Med in terms of these flows. Everybody's going to have their own problems to deal with. And that's just another reason why north-south or north to south political integration over time makes a lot of sense, in the same way that Europe integrated East Europe after the Cold War. Yeah. Thomas, stay there, because I want to throw this up to our panel. I'm seeing this through a very British prism at the moment, because we're having a very active debate in the UK about the Chagos Islands, which does have an impact on the United States because you have a very big base in Diego Garcia. And Keir Starmer is of the view that they should hand it back. And in this framework that we're talking about, this expansionist strategy that is coming from Washington now, how are they going to view that?
I mean, America's not going to be giving things back. I don't think even under, a different president than Donald Trump would the American people want to be giving things back. It was Jimmy Carter who was giving away the Panama Canal, right? And that was not popular. And I think there's also been taking a second look at things like Great Britain's decision with Hong Kong, right? That seemed to cause a lot of problems. So I think there's often goodwill. It's a good idea, but maybe it should stay in the ivory towers.
It's really interesting you say that about giving things back. Let me just read you what Alistair Heath wrote in The Telegraph in London this week. He said, "The progressive realists at the heart of our government are horrified by Trump's plan to buy Greenland, to make America even greater. They cheer as Britain will pay £9 billion it cannot afford to an ally of China to sweeten our inane surrender of the Chagos, one of our last overseas territories. The absurdity," he says, "is that we aren't really helping the world or repaying our debts. We're merely aiding the Chinese, the most regressive fascistic power on earth." Is there a danger that those on the left look weak when you are playing to a global audience?
Well, one always looks weak when they're being compared to an imperialist autocrat. Of course, that's a strong man, and we love our strong men. And I think, look, Donald Trump wants to be the king, and this is his gambit for it. But if you want to see a world where countries take other countries by force or economic coercion, this is the best way to make sure that gets kicked off. Let's just go for it. Let's have the United States go for it across the Americas, which we have no right to do. And then let's see Russia continue to go forward into Europe and China. Or do you want a world where you respect boundaries, where you go through international law, international agreements? We could have a lot of Greenland through agreements, through trade agreements, through business investment. You don't colonize other countries to do that in this day and age.
Thomas, Joel's right, isn't he? It all looks very imperialistic, this. We'll just have a bit of this, we'll have a bit of that, we'll do as we please.
Yeah, if you want to couch it in the terms that Donald Trump uses, yeah, it comes off as very neo-imperialist. But, the European Union has added members progressively over the decades, and nobody's called that neo-imperialism. They've described it a club that people want to join. I think the United States.
I just add one thing to this, which in the context of the way you wrote it, I did have some sympathy with, is that if China and Russia are looking actively at the Arctic, and we know because of climate change, much more of it is becoming open, Greenland and Canada are not going to have the resources to resist Russia and China, and it is going to fall on the United States.
Right. And the same thing's going to happen in Latin America. We're looking at small countries that are going to be devastated progressively. They're already being devastated by climate change. So if you're Ecuador or you're Guatemala and you're looking at this future long term, is your future one of independence and go it alone and hope it all works out? Or does it make a hell of a lot more sense to align yourself with larger political economic unions? And we have to look at it more benignly like that because of these massive structural changes that are coming, and not get caught up in this kind of guilt trip from the 19th century.
It's really interesting reading. Sit down if you're a Brit and you're reading it. Go and have a look at Thomas Barnett's piece in Politico. There's a whole debate there about where Britain fits in all this, outside Europe, and not necessarily part of one of these big global orders. But I'll leave that for another day, perhaps. I will take a short break. Around the world and across the UK, you're watching BBC News.